In the northeastern stretch of the Nile Delta, in the first gray minutes before dawn, there stands a stone. It is pyramid-shaped, its four faces tapered to a single point, and it has been standing in the open court of the temple complex at Heliopolis for long enough that the stone around its base has worn smooth from the passage of feet. The rest of the city is still in shadow. The flat landscape of the delta stretches away on all sides, dark and level, the reed beds along the river channels holding the last of the night's stillness in their stems. The sky above the eastern horizon has not yet changed. And then the tip of this stone, its single polished apex, catches something, a warmth, a first oblique thread of light, still more possibility than illumination, arriving before the disk itself clears the horizon. For one brief interval, the top of this stone is lit while the ground below it is still dark, and the city of Iunu, the city the Greeks would later call Heliopolis, the city of the sun, is still, technically, in night. This stone was called the Benben. The ancient Egyptians believed it was the first surface ever touched by sunlight, not the first surface in the sense of this particular morning's dawn, but the first surface in the absolute sense, at the beginning of everything, before the world had taken its present shape. The Benben was understood to be the point where the sun's creative energy had first made contact with matter, and the pyramid-shaped stones the Egyptians would later build across their landscape, and the pyramidal capstones, called pyramidions, that crowned their obelisks, were all formal echoes of this original object, this first touched thing, standing in the open court at Heliopolis while the morning begins around it. The temple complex in which the Benben stood was one of the largest religious centers in ancient Egypt. Its full name was Iunu, a word that most scholars translate simply as the pillar or the post, a name that may refer to the obelisks that rose there in such number that the city became defined by their silhouettes. What is less in doubt is that Heliopolis was the primary home of Ra, the solar god, the sun made divine, the figure at the center of a religious tradition that shaped Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years and continued to exert its influence long after the last pharaoh's name had been carved into the last royal monument. The Benben stood at Heliopolis. The great hymns to the sun were composed at Heliopolis. The priests who rose before dawn to greet the morning with raised arms and open mouths were trained at Heliopolis. And at the theological center of Heliopolis, doing what it had always done in the tradition's imagination, was Ra, the disk in the sky, the burning eye above the world, the god whose daily voyage across the sky provided the organizing structure for Egyptian time itself. To speak of Ra is to speak of one of the most layered and accumulated of all divine figures, a deity whose identity absorbed, merged with, and reflected the identities of many other gods across many centuries, so that the name Ra does not describe a single fixed portrait, but something more like a solar principle, around which other divine qualities gathered and were held. The tradition holds that Ra was the creator, the king of the gods, the father of the pharaoh, and the engine of the world's daily continuation. He was the disk in the sky, and also the god behind the disk. He was the light that made the fields grow, and the warmth that permitted life to exist along the narrow ribbon of green that the Nile cut through the desert. He was also, in his most expansive theological conception, the source from which everything else in the created world had ultimately come. Not a god inside the universe, but the condition from which the universe had originally proceeded. The iconographic tradition around Ra was specific and thought through with care. He was not depicted the same way at all hours of the day. In the Egyptian understanding, The sun in the morning was not quite the same expression of the solar principle as the sun at noon or the sun approaching the western horizon. Each phase of the day had its own character, its own divine form, its own name and quality. At dawn, Ra took the form of Khepri, the scarab beetle, whose name came from the Egyptian root Khepr, meaning to come into being or to transform. The scarab was an insect the Egyptians had observed rolling balls of dung along the ground, and in this motion, the small creature pushing a sphere across a surface, they saw an image of something larger. Khepri was the sun rolling itself above the horizon, self-generated, self-propelled, coming into being from its own action. The connection was not arbitrary or merely decorative. It carried genuine theological weight. The scarab's behavior described, in miniature, something the Egyptians believed they were watching on a vast scale every morning when the disk of the sun cleared the eastern horizon and began its arc. Khepri was depicted in tomb art and amulets and temple reliefs with unmistakable detail. The scarab beetle himself, rendered in deep blue faience or carved into limestone, holds a round solar disk balanced precisely between his front legs. The beetle's legs are curved around this disk in a posture that reads, across any distance of time, as actively engaged, not holding the disk still, but rolling it, keeping it in motion, doing what the beetle does. Images of Khepri appear throughout Egyptian funerary art, placed at the breast of the mummified dead, carved into the lintels of tomb entrances, set into the walls of temples near their eastern-facing chambers. In each of these contexts, the meaning is the same. This is the force of self-creation, the coming into being, the sun at the moment of its daily emergence from whatever darkness has held it through the night. By noon, the iconographic register changed. The noon sun was Rak in his most direct and powerful form, Rak Hoak, a combination of Rak with Horus of the two horizons, depicted as a falcon-headed man wearing the solar disk above his head, standing upright, the disk at its highest point in the sky. This was the sun at the peak of its arc, its light falling straight down, shadows reduced to their smallest extent, the full force of solar energy directed onto the earth without the modifying angle of morning or the long declension of afternoon. The noon sun was Ra at his most present, most visible, most immediately powerful. Egyptian texts describe this moment as Ra gazing upon the earth with his full eye, the solar disk functioning, in this framing, not just as a heavenly body, but as the burning, radiant eye of the god himself, open and looking down. At dusk, the form changed once more. The sun, as it approached the western horizon, was depicted as an elderly man, his posture bowed, leaning on a staff, the solar disk still burning above his head, but the figure beneath it diminished and slow. This was Ra, grown old across the span of a single day, the solar energy that had blazed at noon, now carrying the weight of a day's passage. What is worth holding here without rushing past it is how complete this theological thinking was. The Egyptians did not describe the sun at different hours simply as the same god doing different things. They understood each phase as a distinct manifestation of the solar principle, each with its own divine name, its own associations, its own visual grammar. The sun was not one thing moving uniformly across the sky. It was a divine being whose nature transformed continuously, and the iconographic tradition recorded each transformation with the same patient precision it brought to everything it recorded. The aging Ra at dusk, his staff in hand, his disk still burning, this image appears on tomb walls in the painted sky, registers of New Kingdom burial chambers, typically in the westernmost panels of the ceiling, where the amber and ochre pigments the painters used deepened toward the colors of late afternoon. The solar disk above him is painted with the same fierce orange red used for the noon sun, only the figure below it has changed. The disk does not diminish. It is Ra's form that carries the passage of time, while the sun itself remains what it always is. The city of Heliopolis also gave Egypt its foundational cosmological narrative, the story of how the world came to be, that the priests there elaborated into what is now called the Heliopolitan cosmogony. In this account, before anything existed, there was only none, a boundless, dark, undifferentiated expanse of primordial water, without surface or direction, without light or movement, the condition of everything before it became anything. From within these waters, by his own will and from his own substance, Atumara emerged. The tradition describes this emergence in a specific way, not as a creation from outside, not as an act performed by a being who was already somewhere and decided to make something new, but as a self-arising. Atumara came into being within the waters of noon and rose from them as a hill, the first solid ground, the first distinction between the water and something that was not water. From himself, Atumara then generated the first divine pair. By some accounts he sneezed or spat. By others, the creative act was one of self-pleasure. The mechanism varies across different versions of the tradition, but the result is consistent. From Ra's own body came Shu, the god of air and light, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. These two were the first created beings, and in begetting them, Ra had made the first distinction in what had been an undifferentiated whole. He had made something that was not himself, but that had come from himself, and in doing so had established the principle by which the rest of creation would proceed. Shu and Tefnut in turn produced Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. And Geb and Nut produced 4 children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, whose stories would come to form the central mythological narrative of Egyptian religious life, the drama of death and resurrection and inheritance that the Egyptians returned to across every period of their history. Together these 9 divine figures, Atum-Ra, Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, and the 4 children of Geb and Nut, formed the Ennead, the company of 9, the first assembly of divine beings whose interactions and relationships shaped the world as the Egyptians understood it. But what the Heliopolitan cosmogony establishes above everything else is the specific position of Ra within this structure. He is not a deity who arrives to find a world already made. He is not even a deity who has set the task of making a world from materials he is given. According to the tradition, Ra is the source from which everything proceeds. He is prior to creation in the sense that he is what creation came from. None existed before him, but none was nothing, a potential without shape or direction, and it was Ra's emergence from that nothing that began the transformation of the undifferentiated into the structured. This position, originating source rather than resident deity, gave Ra a theological authority that was different in kind from the authority of gods who came after him in the cosmological sequence. Osiris ruled the dead. Horus held the kingship of the living world. Thoth commanded knowledge and the ordering of time. But Ra was the condition from which these domains had ultimately derived their existence. His daily voyage across the sky was not in this framework simply one god doing one thing. It was the continued operation of the force that had made the world possible, maintaining the world's existence by continuing to move. At the same time that Ra held this abstract theological position, his relationship to Egyptian kingship was something more immediate and more politically consequential. From at least the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom period, which began in approximately 2613 BCE, the pharaoh bore among his 5 royal names the title Sa-Ra, the son of Ra. This was one of the 5 names the pharaoh held at coronation, each name establishing a different aspect of the king's divine and royal identity. The son of Ra name established the most direct possible genealogical link between the person of the king and the solar god. The king was not merely favored by Ra, not merely protected by Ra, or dedicated to his worship. The king was Ra's son, born from the solar line, a solar being in human form. The implications of this title were extensive and carefully managed. The king's body, in this doctrine, was understood as the earthly counterpart of the solar disk. Ra traversed the sky above the world. The pharaoh moved through the world below, and the 2 motions were parallel expressions of the same divine order. When the pharaoh performed the rites of kingship, stood at the prow of the royal bark during the Opet festival, made offerings in the temple, appeared in the double crown before the assembled court, he was understood to be enacting in the terrestrial register the same sovereign motion that Ra enacted in the celestial one. The sun above and the king below were reflections of each other across the boundary of sky and earth. The cartouche that enclosed the pharaoh's son of Ra name was an oval loop of rope drawn tight at the bottom, a continuous line with no beginning and no end, enclosing the royal name within a protective boundary that also signified the sun's circuit, the unbroken loop of Ra's daily voyage from east to west and through the night back to the east again. Inside that cartouche, for the son of Ra name specifically, were written the symbols that identified the king's personal birth name, the name his mother had given him before he was crowned. This name, the most personal of the 5 royal names, was placed inside the solar loop, protected by it, identified with it. The king's own name held within the sun's circuit, the biography of a human being enclosed within the symbol of a divine journey that had been going on since before the world had taken its present form. What Ra's cult at Heliopolis assembled across the centuries in which it was maintained and elaborated was a theology of extraordinary coherence, a framework in which the daily movement of the sun was simultaneously a physical fact, a divine act, a cosmological necessity, and a political principle. The sun rose. This was Ra completing his eastern rebirth as Khepri. The sun rose because Ra moved, and Ra moved because this was the fundamental motion of the created world, the continuation of the act of creation from which everything else had derived. The pharaoh was the son of this moving principle, and the pharaoh's governance of Egypt was the earthly form of Ra's celestial sovereignty. There was no gap in this structure, no point at which the physical and the theological separated from each other. The sun in the sky and the king in the palace and the god in the temple were held together by a single continuous doctrinal thread that had been woven tightly enough to last 3 millennia. At Heliopolis, before dawn, a priest would rise in the darkness and prepare himself. He would have bathed in the sacred lake, shaved his head and his body to meet the purity requirements the temple tradition demanded, and dressed in the white linen that temple service required. He would move through the passages of the temple complex in the dark, the stones beneath his feet still cold from the night, and come to the edge of the open court facing east. There the benben stood in its silence, its polished tip still dark. The priest would raise both arms toward the eastern horizon. He would begin to speak the words that the tradition had given him, words composed and compiled across generations, words whose purpose was to greet the morning and the God who came with it, to announce to Ra that the world below was ready, that the order was maintained, that the priests were at their stations, and the rites were prepared, and the voyage could begin. The horizon would lighten, not all at once, but in the Egyptian sky, the clear, dry, largely cloudless sky above the delta, in gradations that could be observed and measured. And the darkness would ease, and then the darkness above the eastern horizon would ease first. A faint distinction beginning to form between the sky and the flat line of the earth, the mountains of the horizon, the jagged profile of the hills at the edge of the delta, or the cleaner line of the desert terrain farther east, would become visible as silhouettes. Then the notch between them, the specific point in the sky where the disk always appeared, would begin to hold light. The priest's white linen would catch the first illumination before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the fabric brightening as though the light were arriving at it from all directions simultaneously. The stones of the court remained cold, and then, as they had done before anyone standing there had been born, and as they would continue to do long after everyone standing there was dead, the tip of the Benben stone would catch the first direct sunlight of the morning. Ra was understood to have three syncretic relationships that are worth holding alongside the three iconographic forms, because they describe a different aspect of how his theological identity was assembled over time. The most politically significant of these was his merger with Amun, the hidden god of Thebes. Amun was one of the oldest attested deities in the Egyptian tradition, a god of wind and hidden creative power, whose name meant something like the concealed one, a deity defined not by visibility, but by imperceptible presence, the force behind things, rather than the thing itself. During the New Kingdom period, when Thebes held political primacy in Egypt and its local deity Amun rose to national prominence, the theological merger of Amun and Ra produced the combined deity Amun-Ra, who became the dominant state god of the New Kingdom and held that position with remarkable consistency for centuries. The theological logic of this merger was elegant in the way that good theological thinking often is, bringing together two principles that were in isolation, each incomplete. Rhea was visibility itself, the solar disk, the noon sky, the light that made everything perceivable. Amun was invisibility, the wind, the hidden power, the force present everywhere and seen nowhere. Amun-Ra combined these two principles in a single divine form, the god who was visible in his solar aspect and invisible in his Amun aspect, the god who was both the seen and the unseen dimensions of creative divine power. The double name was written in hieroglyphs inside a royal cartouche, the feathered crown of Amun, the double plume that was his characteristic headdress, rising above the solar disk of Ra, the two symbols combined in a single vertical composition inside the oval of the cartouche's rope. Pressed together, they described something that neither alone could describe. Amun-Ra was addressed in hymns that survive on papyrus and painted on temple walls across Upper and Lower Egypt, hymns that describe a deity of cosmic scope, not a local god, not a patron of one city or one dynasty, but the king of all the gods, the Lord of eternity, the one whose face was the face of the sun, and whose hidden nature pervaded everything beneath the sun. These hymns were composed and sung by priests in the vast temple complex of Karnak at Thebes, the largest religious building complex ever constructed in Egypt, and possibly one of the largest ever built anywhere. The temple grew for centuries, each pharaoh adding courts and pylons and obelisks and hypostyle halls to a structure that eventually covered more than 100 hectares. At its center was the inner sanctuary of Amun-Ra, the dark room where the god's statue stood. tended daily by a small number of specially consecrated priests, whose approach to the statue was preceded by ritual purification, and whose retreat from it was made walking backward, erasing their footprints. Behind all the accumulated layers of theological elaboration, the syncretic mergers, the royal doctrines, the hymns and liturgical texts and festival calendars, stood the basic fact from which the whole tradition began. The sun rises every morning over Egypt. It rises in the east. It moves across the sky. It sets in the west. It rises again the next morning. This has been happening for longer than any human memory can reach, and it will be happening for longer than any human future can plausibly extend. The Egyptians built their religion around this fact, not because they lacked sophisticated alternative frameworks for understanding it, but because they found in it something that deserved the attention and care of their most precise theological thinking. The sun's voyage was regular and reliable. It was the one constant in a world that contained many inconstants: flood and drought, plague and war, the rise and fall of dynasties, the slow silting of river channels, and the gradual shift of the delta's edge. All of these things changed. The sun did not change. This is the tradition that Ra stands at the center of Paf, not a tradition of apocalyptic drama or cosmic uncertainty, but of assured, methodical, continuous movement, the disk clearing the eastern horizon in the morning, arcing across the sky in the day, and descending toward the west in the afternoon, each phase marked by a divine form and a divine name, each hour attended by its own figure, each point in the arc meaningful in a specific and documented way. The tradition had its priesthood and its liturgies, its architectural monuments and its carved and painted images, its royal titles and its cosmological narratives. All of it was organized around a single image, the disk moving from one side of the sky to the other, day after day, without interruption, as it had moved since before the world had its present shape. Rak was the god of this movement. He was also, in the Heliopolitan understanding, the source of everything that made the world, the kind of place where such movement had meaning. Before Atumra rose from the waters of Nun, there was no sky for anything to traverse. There was no east or west, because those directions only exist in relation to the sun's movement. There was no day, and there was no structure of time that could have given a day its character. When Ra emerged from Nun and generated the first divine pair from his own substance, what he was doing, in the tradition's own framing, was making the world the kind of thing that could have a sky in it, and a sun in that sky, and a daily voyage for that sun to make. The Benben stone at Heliopolis stood in the open court of the temple as a physical record of this. It was not worshipped as an idol in the simple sense. It was regarded as a monument, a material marker of a mythological event, the first contact between the solar force and material existence. Pilgrims came to Heliopolis to see it. Priests incorporated it into their ritual landscape. Pharaohs referenced it in their foundation texts when they built temples elsewhere. The stone sat in its court through the seasons, through the dynasties, through the slow geological patience of the delta accumulating silt, and the river shifting its channels, and the centuries doing what centuries do to everything except the sun's course above it. In the great temple complex, visitors moving through the processional route from the outer courts to the inner sanctuary would pass, at some point, through the open-air space where the Benben stood. The court would be flooded with morning light. The open-air design was deliberate, one of the distinctive features of solar temple architecture, as opposed to the deep, dark inner chambers of temples dedicated to other gods. Ra's temples were open to the sky because Ra was in the sky, and to worship Ra was to stand in the thing being worshipped. The light fell on the stones, and the white linen and the gold leaf of the monuments, and the benben at the center of it all caught everything and gave nothing back in particular. It was simply there, polished and tapered, the point of it aimed upward at the disk, making its passage overhead. The pharaohs who built at Heliopolis were inscribing themselves into this tradition each time they added a structure, each time they raised an obelisk, or founded a temple, or carved their name into the granite wall of an existing sanctuary. To build at Heliopolis was to participate in the maintenance of the solar order, to demonstrate that the king understood his role as the earthly counterpart of the solar voyage, to leave in stone the evidence that during his reign the tradition had been cared for. The obelisks that rose over the city, their pyramidal tips, called pyramidions, sheathed in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, so that they would catch the morning light at a distance and throw it back across the delta, were formal echoes of the benben. The whole city was an echo of the benben. The whole tradition was, in a sense, an elaboration of that single stone and what it was understood to have marked. The pharaoh's son of Ra name was the most personal of his titles, and the one that connected him most directly to this continuous solar tradition. When a new king was crowned and his 5 names were proclaimed, the son of Ra name was the name his mother had used, the name that carried his individual human identity, but it was now enclosed in the cartouche placed inside the solar circuit, identified with the disk's unbroken loop from east to west and back to east again. The gold collar of the pharaoh, pressed flat against the chest, might carry this name, worked in repousse on its surface, the oval cartouche, the symbols inside it, the falcon that represented Horus, and the solar disk that represented Ra, pressed together inside the rope loop, the weight of the sun carried in gold against the king's skin. This is where the tradition held the pharaoh, inside the solar circuit, carrying the sun's name, embodying in the world below the motion that Ra enacted in the sky above. The benben received the first light of each morning. The priests raised their arms at the horizon's edge, their white linen catching the first illumination, and in the palace, in the throne room, on the gold surface of the royal collar, inside the oval loop of the cartouche, the name pressed there in metal that was itself the color of the sun, was the king's own name, enclosed in the symbol of a voyage that had been making itself across the sky since before the first stone of the first temple had been laid, and that would continue making itself long after the last gold collar had been folded and placed in a tomb and the limestone sealed over it. The sun rises over the delta. The tip of the benben stone catches the first light. The city of Iunu receives the morning in the same moment it has received every morning since the tradition was old enough to record, and somewhere on the chest of a carved figure on a temple wall, or worked into the gold of a collar removed from a royal burial and placed under the lights of a museum case. Small, elliptical, its hieroglyphs worn to a faint relief by the passage of time, the son of Ra cartouche still holds its name, the falcon, the disk, the unbroken loop of rope pressed into gold, carrying the weight of the sun. Somewhere beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza, in a sealed limestone pit cut flush with the desert floor, 143 pieces of cedar wood lay in darkness for 45 centuries without being touched. When archaeologists opened that pit in 1954, the smell of cedar still rose from the stone, not faintly and not as a trace, but as though the wood had only recently been placed there, as though the resin sealed inside the grain had been waiting patiently in the dark for someone to come and find it. The planks were pale, they were shaped. Each one had been cut and curved and fitted to interlock with every adjacent piece without a single nail. a technique the Egyptians called rope lashing, the hull held together by the tension of binding rather than the rigidity of metal, the whole vessel designed to flex slightly the way a living thing flexes, rather than to hold rigid against the water it was built to cross. The water this boat was built for was not the Nile. It was not any river that runs through the known world. The curve of each plank, the angle of each joint, the particular taper of the hull, these were proportioned for the celestial waters overhead, for the wide sky ocean through which the sun moved each day, and for the voyage that never ended and never failed, from the eastern horizon to the western threshold, dawn to dusk, beginning without interruption. From the first morning, the world had a sun to move across it. This was the solar bark, or rather, one reflection of it in physical form, one gesture toward the divine vessel that Egyptian religious thought described with remarkable consistency across a span of nearly 3,000 years. The boat buried beside the pyramid of Khufu was not the Manjet itself. The Manjet existed in a register beyond wood and rope and cedar resin, but the boat was a way of holding that idea in the world of matter, a pharaoh's means of ensuring that he too might travel with Ra across the sky after death, might take a place among the divine crew, and be carried on those wide celestial waters through all the hours of the day. The physical boat was an expression of a theological certainty that the sun moved in a vessel, that the vessel had a crew, and that the crossing was not a metaphor, but an event that occurred, precisely, every single day. The Manjet is the name Egyptian tradition gives to the bark that carries Ra through the daylight hours. The name has been translated by scholars in more than one way. One reading holds that it refers to the morning boat, the vessel of the first half of the day, the ascent. Another reading proposes something grander, the bark of millions, a name that would suggest not a single crossing, but an accumulation of crossings, so vast the number loses individual weight. Both readings are plausible, both tell something true. The Manjet is at once the boat of the particular morning and the boat of every morning that has ever been, the vessel of the one daily voyage and the vessel of an innumerable, uncountable succession of voyages, each one identical to the last, and each one the only one that matters in the moment. It is happening. The sun rising on any given day is Ra on the Manjet, crossing the sky, following the same arc the tradition has always described, arriving at the same western threshold it has always reached. There was a second bark. The Mesektet carried Ra through the 12 hours of the night, through the underworld, through the regions of darkness, beneath the world where different rules held and different dangers waited. The Mesektet and the Manjet together completed the cycle, one vessel for the sky and one for the earth's dark underside, both necessary, both part of the same unbroken circuit. But it is the Manjet that concerns the daylight tradition, the visible vessel, the one whose passage could be watched from any open-air court, any rooftop, any field along the river, simply by looking up. The sun disk crossing the open sky was, in the Egyptian theological account, the sign of the Manjet in motion, Ra aboard it, the crew at their stations, the divine voyage proceeding on schedule. The physical bark, as it appears in Egyptian art, was not a simple object. A crescent-shaped hull, deep and curved at the waterline, riding high at prow and stern. At its center, a naos, a small shrine, a cabin of divine architecture, the innermost protected space, where Ra's form rested. The naos was draped in cloth, its interior a space of deliberate concealment, the god within it, present but not fully visible, in the way that divine presence is often indicated in Egyptian iconographic conventions, not by showing everything, but by showing the frame, the protection, the boundary, and allowing what is inside to be understood rather than depicted. Around the naos, along the deck, divine figures stood at regular intervals, each one upright, each one oriented outward, each one facing the direction of the water beyond the hull. The vessel moved, they remained still. Their stillness was not passivity, it was the particular stillness of figures who have a function and are performing it continuously, who do not need to move because their very presence is the act. In the illustrated papyri of the Book of the Dead, this image appears with remarkable consistency across different hands, different centuries, different regions of production. The crescent hull is almost always deep blue or gold against the warm background of the papyrus. The naos stands at the center, slightly elevated, its cloth hanging still. The divine figures range along the deck with a symmetry that feels architectural rather than accidental. At the bow of the vessel, the prow that cuts forward into the direction of travel, something curls upward from the hull itself, not a carved ornament, but a living form. The Uraeus cobra, the sacred serpent of divine protection, the same form that rises from the brow of the pharaoh's crown, here expanded to fill the entire forward curve of the vessel. Its hood is spread wide. Its body is curved to follow the line of the prow, shaped by the bark's own architecture. Its eyes face forward, into the direction the bark travels, into whatever the next hour of the sky holds. The cobra does not look back. It does not look inward toward the naos or the crew. It holds the forward gaze, the gaze that precedes arrival. The solar boat pits at Giza tell something specific about how this theological object was understood by the people who built the pyramids. There were several pits cut into the bedrock around the Great Pyramid. Long, narrow, sealed with roofing blocks of limestone, so heavy it required considerable effort to move even one of them. The pit that yielded the disassembled cedar boat contained the planks in a particular order, the larger structural pieces at one end, the smaller ones layered in between, the whole assemblage arranged as though someone had taken a complete vessel apart, labeled every piece in their mind, and placed it down in exactly the sequence that would allow another person to reassemble it without confusion. The boat could be put back together. It was not destroyed or offered in fragments. It was stored. It was waiting. When the 143 pieces were brought to the surface and laid out in sequence, the full shape of the hull became visible, a crescent curve of cedar planks, each one shaped to interlock with the next, the whole structure held together through tension rather than nail or spike, a method of construction that produces a hull capable of flex and give rather than rigid resistance. A boat made this way moves with the water rather than against it. In the theological context, the implication is quiet but present. The celestial waters are not the Nile, and the vessel designed for divine crossing was not the same vessel designed for the practical commerce of the river. Different waters required different forms. The Manjet was built for something else entirely. The cedar from which Khufu's boat was constructed came from Lebanon. Cedar did not grow in Egypt. The wood was imported, carried by sea or river from the Levantine coast, a material that carried in its grain the memory of a different landscape, mountains, altitude, the smell of conifer forests far above the desert. In a land where timber was scarce, cedar was precious. That it was used here in this quantity, sealed underground where no one would ever see or use it in the practical sense, says something about the particular weight of the theological intention. This was not a display. It was a provision, the gift of a complete vessel to a god's crossing, offered to the sky water in the form of a boat buried in the earth, made of wood that had never known Egyptian soil, Among the most detailed continuous records of the Manjet's passage through daylight is a New Kingdom text known as the Book of the Day. This is not a widely known text in the way some Egyptian sources are. It does not circulate in modern popular accounts with the frequency of the Book of the Dead or the pyramid texts, but it survives in considerable detail on the ceilings of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, particularly those of Ramesses VI and Ramesses IX, where the painted astronomical ceilings preserve the full sequence of the bark's 12-hour daytime crossing in images arranged across the horizontal span of stone overhead. The images were painted on ceilings, not incidentally, but precisely, so that the king lying in his sarcophagus below would look upward as a sleeping or resting figure looks upward and see the sky above him, the bark crossing it, the hours of light proceeding in order from one side of the chamber to the other. Under raking light, the particular low-angle illumination used by archaeologists to reveal shallow carving or painting that the flat overhead light obscures. The ceilings of these tombs show a sequence of barks progressing across the stone from one wall to the other. Each image of the Manjet is slightly further along its arc than the one before. The crew is in position, the now stands at center. The procession moves left to right, or east to west if one aligns the chamber with the direction the sun travels, and the sequence can be read like a sentence written very slowly across the sky of a room. 1 hour, then the next, one position, then the position that follows. The bark never pauses between its painted iterations. It is always in motion, even in the frozen medium of painted stone, because the motion is the thing the image is recording, not a single moment, but a continuous passage rendered in the only way painting can render it, which is in stills, placed in order, carrying the mind forward through the arc by the logic of sequence rather than the logic of time. The goddess Maat was among those who traveled on the Manjet. Her name was also the word for order, for the particular cosmic order that Egyptian theology held to be the correct state of the world, the arrangement of things as they were meant to be, the condition that made life possible, and the sun's crossing reliable. She was depicted as a female figure, and her single distinguishing mark was the ostrich feather she wore in her headdress. The feather was her symbol, the measure against which a human heart was weighed in the hall of judgment, and the same feather appears in the hieroglyph for her name, the sign pressed upward into the air above her head, with the lightness that only very large primary feathers have, a lightness that seems improbable given their size, the feather holding itself up against what should be the pull of the world. In paintings of the Manjet, Maat is often placed at the prow. Her posture is absolutely still. The ostrich feather catches a wind that cannot be a wind in any ordinary sense, because the bark rides celestial waters rather than terrestrial air, but the feather moves slightly against its invisible medium as the vessel carries it forward. Maat does not steer. She does not guard in the active, armed sense. Her presence at the prow is something more fundamental. She is the condition of the crossing. The Manjet moves forward correctly because Maat is aboard, because the cosmic order she embodies is not simply a passenger, but a precondition. Without her, the crossing would not be the thing it is supposed to be. It would be something else, a traversal of the sky by a vessel without orientation, without the alignment that makes 1 hour follow correctly from the last and the sun arrive at the western threshold at the right moment in the right form. Thuji traveled on the bark as well. He appears in Egyptian art in two primary forms, as a baboon and as an ibis-headed man, and it is the ibis-headed form that most often appears in scenes of the Manjet's crossing. The ibis beak is long and precisely curved. built for probing into river mud with a particular kind of focused downward attention. And when Thoth is depicted at work on the bark's deck, the beak is often inclined slightly downward, the angle of concentration, of attending carefully to what is immediately before the eye, rather than scanning the horizon. What is before Thoth's eye, in most of these images, is a papyrus scroll and a reed pen. He is writing, the sky is passing, the hours are advancing, and Thoth is noting them, recording each one, placing them in their proper order within a document that holds the record of the crossing from its beginning to its end. This is worth pausing over because it describes something precise about what the Egyptians understood Thoth to be doing on the Manjet. He was not there to protect the bark. He was not there to guide it in the navigational sense, choosing a course through unfamiliar waters. He was there to witness and to record, to ensure that the passage of the day was documented in a form that persisted beyond the moment of its occurrence, that the sequence of hours was not simply experienced and then lost to what comes after it, but preserved, kept, held in the archive of divine knowledge that Thoth maintained across his long association with writing and with the reckoning of time. The hours of the day did not simply pass, they were written down. They existed in two registers simultaneously, the register of event, the actual movement of the sun across the sky, and the register of record, the marks made by an ibis pen on papyrus, unrolled on the deck of a divine bark, the afternoon light falling across the wet ink as the vessel moves forward, and the words dry into permanence. Thoth, in some versions of the tradition, is credited with inventing writing itself. In others, he is the keeper of divine knowledge, the librarian of what the gods know, the one who holds the records that allow the cosmos to be administered without confusion. His presence on the Manjet was not ceremonial, it was functional. The divine voyage required documentation as much as it required navigation, and the navigation was of a kind that the tradition did not describe as uncertain. The sky route was known, the hours were fixed, the sequence was established. What remained to be done at each hour was to note it, to confirm, in the medium of written language, that this hour had occurred, that it had occurred in the right order, that the bark had reached this position at the correct point in its arc, and that everything was proceeding as it was supposed to proceed. The knolls at the center of the bark, the small shrine draped in cloth, held Ra's form in a way the tradition described as protective concealment. The direct gaze of the sun at noon, Ra's in his full power at the peak of his arc, was understood to be something that could not safely be looked upon directly without mediation. The knobs provided that mediation, the cloth, the walls, the interior darkness within which the divine form rested, the surrounding structure that made the bark's center a place apart from the open sky around it. Divine figures ranged along the outer deck, faced outward, and held their positions as guards and presences. What they guarded was not the vessel in the sense of protecting it from a threat. In the context of this passage through the daylight hours, the crossing was conducted in the full light of Ra's own presence, which was itself the greatest protection available. What they provided was a kind of oriented attention. They faced outward, so that the inward center could remain what it needed to remain, enclosed, concentrated, moving forward in the condition of divine reserve. This quality, the reserve at the center of the moving vessel, the stillness within the forward motion, is one of the things Egyptian religious iconography returns to repeatedly in its depictions of the solar crossing. The bark moves, it crosses the sky, it passes through 1 hour and into the next. The divine figures on its deck do not move with the kind of activity that mortal motion implies. They do not row, they do not steer in the visible sense, they do not gesture toward the horizon or confer about the route. They hold their positions. The bark moves because the sky moves, because the sun must cross it, because that is what has always happened and what continues to happen. The crew is not the cause of the motion. They are its companions, its witnesses, its context, the assembled divine intelligence that accompanies the crossing and makes it the event it is, rather than merely a disk moving across the sky. The cedars of Lebanon that gave Khufu's boat its wood were felled by hand, carried to the coast, loaded onto vessels, transported to Egypt by people whose names are not recorded in any source that survives. The planks were shaped by craftsmen following proportions that reflected a theological specification rather than a practical nautical one. The finished boat was taken apart, not destroyed, but carefully disassembled, the pieces placed in order within the pit. The pit sealed with blocks of limestone weighing tons, the desert floor restored over the top so that the surface showed nothing. 45 centuries. The cedar waited in its ordered disassembly, smelling faintly of resin in the sealed stone dark, holding the shape of a hull designed for celestial waters, in the form of numbered pieces waiting to be put back together. When the planks were reassembled in the 20th century of the Common Era, a full functional hull took shape. The proportions were correct, the joints held, the rope lashing technique worked as intended. The boat that emerged from that pit, rebuilt from its constituent pieces, was not a ruin or a fragment, but a complete vessel, 43 meters long, crescent-hulled, papyrus scroll-shaped, at prow and stern, in the characteristic Egyptian style, shaped by the theology of a civilization that had spent more than 1,000 years before Khufu's time, developing its understanding of what the divine bark looked like and how it moved. The result was not speculative, it was specific. The people who built it knew the shape they were building toward. The hieroglyphic ceiling of Ramesses VI's tomb preserves the manjet in a different register, not wood and rope, but paint and mineral pigment on stone, the colors still vivid under the protected atmosphere of the sealed chamber after more than 3,000 years. The celestial background is the deep oxblood red that New Kingdom painters used for astronomical and divine ceilings, a color that reads immediately as otherworldly, as the register above or beyond the ordinary world, the sky understood as an inner surface rather than an outer one, the inside of something the world moves through, rather than the open emptiness above it. Against this background, the bark appears in repeating iterations across the horizontal span of the ceiling, each one slightly advanced along its arc. The full sequence of the 12 daytime hours represented across the width of a stone ceiling in a chamber cut 60 feet into the limestone of the Valley of the Kings. The artists who painted these ceilings were working from a precise theological specification. The manjet at the first hour of day looks like this. At the second hour, it has moved here. At noon, the solar disk is at its highest point above the deck, the figure of Ra-Horakhti upright within the naos, the divine crew holding their positions in the full glare of the midday sun. As the afternoon hours advance, the bark descends along its arc, and the quality of the painted light in the surrounding sky, the depth of color in the oxblood ground, the angle of the shadows on the deck, shifts in ways so subtle they might be imagined, but are present. By the 12th hour of day, the bark is approaching the western threshold, and the painted sky around it has deepened from the clarity of the morning register to something richer, more saturated, holding more of what is about to change. The Book of the Dead papyri, in which the manjet also appears, were produced over a span of centuries in workshops across Egypt for the use of individuals who could afford the commission. Each one was slightly different in its rendering, a different hand, a different quality of pigment, a different level of detail in the divine figures ranged along the deck. But the essential image was consistent. The crescent hull, the central naos, the outward-facing divine figures, and at the bow, the uraeus cobra. This last element was not decorative. The uraeus in Egyptian iconography was the symbol of divine protective fire, the serpent that spat flame at the enemies of the divine order, the rearing cobra of the pharaoh's brow that announced his authority to strike down what opposed it. On the manjet, the uraeus was built into the prow not as an addition or an ornament, but as an extension of the bark's own form. The boat and its protection were the same object. To travel on the manjet was to travel within the cobra's gaze, within the field of its forward attention, within the radius of what it would not allow to approach. It is a quiet image in the end, not fierce in the way that an image of active combat is fierce, not alarming in the way that a raised weapon is alarming. The cobra at the prow of the manjet is completely still in every painted or drawn instance of it that survives. Its hood is spread, its eyes are open, its body follows the curve of the hull, pressed into the shape the bark requires. It does not strike in any of these images, because striking would mean that something had come close enough to require it, and in the daylight hours of the crossing, in the wide brightness of the sky above the world, nothing comes that close. The cobra's forward gaze is sufficient. The spreading of the hood is sufficient. The particular quality of readiness it embodies, held absolutely still at the leading edge of a divine vessel crossing the sky, is the gesture of protection so complete that it requires no action to confirm itself. The manjet moved through 12 stations of the sky, one for each hour of daylight. The passage watched from below by everyone who looked up, priests in their open-air courts, laborers in the river fields, children learning what it meant to live in a world where the sun was a god aboard a vessel, where the disk crossing the sky was not a physical phenomenon requiring physical explanation, but an event in the life of a divine being, a moment in a voyage that had no beginning anyone could remember and no end anyone expected. The tradition held this image for nearly 3 millennia. It held it with the kind of constancy that comes not from rigidity, but from genuine conviction, the feeling that this is what is actually happening, that the sun crosses the sky in a boat, that the boat has a crew, that the crew includes figures whose presence is the condition of cosmic order rather than its maintenance. The crescent hull, the naos at the center, draped in cloth, its interior held separate from the open sky, the divine figures at their stations, outward facing still. The papyrus scroll unrolled on the deck where Thoth bends slightly forward, the ibis beak inclined toward the marks he is making, the hours accumulating in the medium of written language, while the sky outside accumulates in the medium of light. Mat at the prow, the ostrich feather, rising from her headdress in the quiet air of celestial waters, her posture one of such completeness that the word stillness barely begins to describe it. The sun disk above the naos at the highest point of the arc, casting the shortest shadows the day will hold, every object on the deck of the manjet standing in its own smallest shadow directly beneath itself. And forward of all of this, forward of the crew and the naos and the divine figures and the feather and the pin moving across the papyrus, the uraeus, the cobra of protection, pressed into the bow, its hood spread against whatever the next hour of the sky holds, its eyes directed always forward, not behind the bark, where the hours already crossed are receding, not upward toward the disk or inward toward the naos, forward into the direction of travel, into the advancing light of the next hour and the next station and the next position along the arc. the hood permanently spread, the posture permanently alert, the body of the cobra shaped by the vessel it protects into the form of a prow, a leading edge, a forward curve, a shape that arrives somewhere before anything else aboard the bark does. The Book of the Dead papyrus that shows this image most clearly, the crescent hull, the naos, the standing figures, the cobra at the bow, was made by hand by someone whose name may or may not be recorded in the colophon. The ink was carbon black and mineral red. The papyrus was dried reed pith, pressed flat, dried in the Egyptian sun. The painter mixed the pigments in small stone palettes and applied them with a fine brush, working in natural light, in a workshop near the Nile. The boat that emerged from that process was not Khufu's cedar bark. It was not physical at all. It was marks on dried plant material, the image of a divine vessel committed to the most durable lightweight medium available to the civilization that produced it. And yet, the cobra at the bow faces forward. It has always faced forward in every one of these images, across every century of production, in every workshop, in every part of Egypt where this image was committed to papyrus or stone or painted plaster. The direction of the gaze does not change because the direction of the voyage does not change. The manjet moves from east to west, from the first light of morning to the last amber of the day's final hour, and the cobra at its bow holds its spread hood toward the west and does not look away. This is a boat that carries its own protection built into its very shape, the hood spread at the prow, not as a figure placed upon the vessel, but as the vessel's own leading edge. The protection and the progress indistinguishable from each other. The cobra's forward gaze and the bark's forward motion, the same single-directed thing, moving through the wide hours of the sky. In the last minutes before dawn, the eastern horizon holds a particular kind of darkness. It is not the full dark of midnight, when the sky above the Nile is evenly black from one edge of the world to the other. It is something different, a darkness that has already begun to change, that carries within it the faint announcement of its own end. The stars near the horizon have dimmed. The sky directly overhead is still deep, still scattered with light, but at the rim of the earth, where the sky meets the land, the black has shifted almost imperceptibly toward a blue so dark it barely qualifies as a color at all. The hills and ridges of the eastern desert are beginning to resolve out of the undifferentiated dark. They appear first as suggestions, a slightly darker density against the less dark sky, and then slowly as distinct shapes. Two low mountains, their flat summits barely pronouncing themselves against the pre-dawn atmosphere, define a notch between them where the sky is now faintly paler than everywhere else. That notch is the place. The disk will appear precisely there. The ancient Egyptians gave this threshold a name. They called it a cut, a word that carried within it the meaning of the horizon, but more specifically, the horizon as a place of becoming, the boundary at which the sun neither simply rose nor simply existed, but came into being again each morning from a condition of not yet being. The hieroglyphic symbol for a cut renders this moment with an economy that Egyptian visual language often achieves, a perfect circle, the disk, seated in the notch between two symmetrical mountains, not rising dramatically above them, seated within them, cradled between their flat summits, as though the mountains themselves were a cupped hand, holding the disk in the moment just before it was released into the sky. On a pale limestone temple jamb, incised shallowly into the stone, this symbol was carved and filled with paint, and the depth of the carving was such that at noon, when the sun fell directly overhead, the carved lines nearly vanished into their own shadows, the symbol almost invisible, the horizon image pressed flat by the overhead light. But at dawn, when the sun was low, and its light came in at an angle almost parallel to the surface of the stone, the carved edges caught the light, and the symbol deepened, and the circle between the two mountains stood out from the pale surface of the wall with a clarity it held at no other hour. The carving was made to be most legible at exactly the moment it described. This is the kind of precision the Egyptian religious imagination extended into its artifacts and its architecture, a precision that is, once noticed, difficult to set aside. The name of the god who crossed this threshold at dawn was Khupri, not Ra in his noon aspect, not Ra Harakti at the height of his arc, but Khupri, a figure iconographically distinct, his form the scarab beetle rather than the falcon-headed man, his body carrying the solar disk balanced precisely between his front legs in the posture of a beetle actively rolling a sphere of dung across the ground. The Egyptians observed the scarab rolling its ball and saw in that action something they recognized: the movement of the solar disk across the sky, propelled by a divine energy working from behind and beneath, rolling the great light forward through the vault of the heavens by the same muscular, persistent forward effort the beetle applied to its own work on the desert floor. The name Khupri came from the Egyptian root khupr, to come into being. The scarab was not simply the god of the rising sun. The scarab was the god of becoming itself, the divine force of emergence from non-existence into existence, and Ra in the form of Khupri was Ra at the moment of his daily transformation from the not yet risen to the fully irrevocably present. That transformation, according to the oldest Egyptian accounts of the sky's geography, took place inside the body of the goddess Nut. The tradition held that Nut was the sky, not that she governed it or represented it in some abstract sense, but that she was its physical substance. Her body arched overhead from horizon to horizon, her fingertips touching the eastern mountains, and her toes resting on the western ones, the inside of her body, the roof of the world, the stars painted across her belly in their ordered courses. Rak traveled through her, the book of the day, a new kingdom text painted across the ceilings of certain royal tombs, charts this passage with a cartographic specificity that is deeply considered, locating each stage of the day's voyage at a precise point along Nut's body, so that the geography of the sky becomes the geography of the divine feminine form, and the progress of the sun becomes something more like a passage through a living interior than a crossing of open air. At dawn, Ross emerged from Nut's mouth. At morning, he was at her throat. At noon, at the level of her heart. Through the long afternoon, he moved along her thighs, and at dusk, as the light thickened and the sky shifted from gold to amber to something deeper, Ross descended toward the western threshold of the world and was received by the tradition's account into Nut's birth canal, the sun not simply setting, but being taken back into the body of the sky that had given it passage, preparatory to being born again. The same word for emergence into being as the one attached to the scarab, the same root, khepr, applying to the same event on the same schedule, with the same unfailing regularity it had applied to yesterday's dawn, and the dawn before that, as far back as any record went. The first hour of the day begins inside the hieroglyphic notch between the mountains, and it does not begin quietly. Egyptian hymns to the morning sun describe the eastern horizon at the moment of Ra's appearance as a place of gathered voices. The Ennead ranged along the banks of the celestial river, the hour goddesses calling out the arrival of the bark, divine baboons at the bases of the great obelisks, with their forelegs raised and their mouths open in the particular high-pitched cry that the tradition associated with dawn greeting. The 12 hours of the daylight sky were each personified as a goddess in the Egyptian understanding of how the day was structured. Each one held the gate that separated her hour from the next. Each one had a name written in a cartouche beside her image on the tomb walls where she appeared, and her role was not passive. She was not simply a marker of time's passage, but an active participant in Ra's forward progress, responsible for calling out his name and announcing his arrival at her threshold so that the correct transition could be made from one division of the sky to the next. The hours were not empty intervals between significant events. The hours were themselves divine, each one a distinct being with a specific function, the whole sequence of them forming a structure through which the day was organized and through which Ra was escorted from the point of his rising to the point of his descent. The first hour goddess stands at the eastern gate, and the tradition holds that her announcement is what permits the crossing. Without it, the bark cannot pass, Ra cannot proceed. This is not a detail of mythology that the Egyptians seem to have held lightly. The entire system of time, the correct unfolding of day and night and season, the maintenance of the right order of things, depended on each gate goddess making her proclamation at the correct moment in the correct form. The word for this right order was Mat, the concept that encompassed truth, justice, cosmic balance, the correct arrangement of all things in relation to all other things, and Mat was not merely an abstract principle, but a goddess, a figure depicted with a single ostrich feather in her headdress, present aboard the solar bark as a member of its company, her presence itself constituting a kind of guarantee that the voyage was proceeding as it should. Where Mat was, things were as they were supposed to be. The bark traveled in her company, and the hour goddesses opened their gates to receive it, and the day moved forward from one station to the next in the order that had been established at the beginning of things, and that the entire apparatus of Egyptian religious practice existed to maintain. The second and third hours carry the bark across the lower sky of morning, when the light is still slanted and long shadowed, and the air above the Nile carries the coolness of the night still burning off from the river's surface. By the third hour, the sun has climbed high enough that its disk is no longer orange or gold but white, and the shadows on the ground have shortened and turned, rotating slowly around the base of every standing object as the disk's angle changes. The painted ceilings of the Valley of the King's Tombs chart this progression with a kind of sequential precision that is not quite a story and not quite a map, but something between, the bark repeated at regular intervals across the full span of the ceiling, each instance of it placed slightly higher on the arc. The overall effect, when the ceiling is read from left to right in the register of daylight hours, of watching a single object complete a slow, inevitable curve across a painted sky. The oxblood red of the New Kingdom's celestial background deepens the gold of the bark's hull, and the small divine figures ranged along the deck face outward toward whatever lies below and beyond the bark's passage, their postures formal and still, each one attending to a particular direction or function, while the overall vessel moves forward through a register of painted time. At the fourth hour, Ra's course has established itself. The sky is fully open. The great arc of the day is past its beginning and not yet at its peak, and the bark moves through an intermediate region of the celestial body of Nut that the tradition associates with her throat and chest, the body's interior at its most spacious, the passage clear, the light overhead no longer the reddish light of emergence, but the full, clear, growing light of mid-morning. It is worth dwelling on what it means in the Egyptian cosmological understanding to be inside the sky, not beneath it, not under its dome, inside it. Ra's voyage is a passage through an interior, and the sky is not empty space through which a sun happens to move, but a divine body whose internal geography has specific character at each point along its length. This distinction between a cosmology in which the sun crosses a sky and one in which the sun passes through a goddess produces a different quality of intimacy between the god and the world he illuminates. The relationship is not that of an object moving over a surface. It is something more mutual than that, more interior. The 5th and 6th hours bring the bark to the region of the heart. The noon hour, the 6th station of the 12, is the pivot of the entire day's voyage, the point at which the arc reverses from its rising slope to its descending one, the highest point the disk will reach on any given day, the moment at which, in the Egyptian account, Rasa assumes the form of Ra-Horakhti. The name combines Ra with Horus of the two horizons, not Horus as the sky god in his general sense, but Horus in his specific solar aspect, the falcon whose right eye was the sun and whose left eye was the moon, whose dominion was the arc between the eastern and the western horizon, and every point along it. Ra-Horakhti stands at the summit of the day's arc, and the tradition describes this moment as Ra gazing upon the earth with his full eye, the solar disk understood explicitly as the eye of Ra, burning in the sky overhead, the gaze of the god directed downward with its complete unmediated force. The eye of Ra carries a weight in Egyptian theology that extends well beyond the noon hour. It is associated with protective power, with destructive capability when turned against enemies, with a divine gaze that perceives all things that occur beneath the sky. At noon, that eye is directly overhead. The gaze falls straight down. The shadows on the deck of the Manjet are directly beneath every standing object. At the shortest, they will be all day, a detail that connects the abstract theological fact of Ra's gaze to the specific, observable geometry of midday light. The same light that made the occult carving on the temple jammed nearly disappear each day as the sun climbed past its angle of legibility. In the paintings of Ra-Horakhti aboard the Manjet at noon, the falcon-headed figure stands upright, the solar disk at its highest position above the deck. The painted shadows on the bark's surface are short and gathered beneath the figure's feet. The posture is still, contained, formal, not triumphant in the way a victory is depicted in battle scenes, but simply present, fully present, the body occupying its position in the sky at the moment of its greatest altitude, with the same quality of settled, continuous attention that the entire voyage is given in Egyptian art. This is not a moment of crisis or exertion. The noon hour is not the climax of a drama. It is simply the highest station on a regular expected path. The hour goddess of the 6th station announces Ra's arrival, the gate opens, and the bark passes from the ascending arc into the descending one. The movement imperceptible in any single moment, but continuous, certain. The same afternoon arrival at the same western gate, accomplished by the same procedure at the end of every passage since the beginning of what the Egyptians understood as time. The 7th hour carries the bark past the heart of the sky and into the afternoon registers of Na't's body. The quality of the afternoon light above the Nile is distinct from morning light, still strong, still warm, but now coming from the west side of overhead rather than the east, the shadows beginning to stretch in the opposite direction from where they were at dawn, the angle of the disk lower on its arc, the landscape below receiving the light differently than it did in the morning hours. The painted ceilings do not show the bark slowing down in the afternoon. There is no iconographic indication of weariness or of the sun's energy diminishing. The figures aboard the Manjet in the 7th, 8th, and 9th hour registers occupy the same formal postures as in the morning hours, the vessel maintaining the same relationship to its celestial context, the same purposeful, even deliberate motion that characterizes every stage of the day's voyage, from the first announcement at the eastern gate to the final descent in the west. The consistency of the presentation is itself an argument. What the paintings assert, through their refusal to dramatize any single hour as more significant or more effortful than any other, is the reliability of what they depict. Every hour the same, every day the same arc, every gate opening to receive the bark and then releasing it, each goddess speaking her part, the whole sequence completing itself without exception. The 10th and 11th hours move through the long, late afternoon, the sky above the Nile, shifting from white gold to the deeper gold that precedes the hour of amber and red. The shadows at this hour are long again, matching the long shadows of early morning, but pointing in the opposite direction, westward, toward the same destination the bark is moving toward. There is a quality of convergence in the late afternoon light above the Nile that the landscape itself seems to understand. The shadows of the palm trees angled toward the desert cliffs, the cliffs themselves lit from the east, now rather than the west, the red and orange of the stone deepening as the sun descends toward them. On the west bank of the river, the great escarpments of the Theban necropolis rise above the flat green of the cultivated strip and the blue of the river. The cliffs are pale limestone, almost white at noon, but in the hour before sunset they warm to orange and then to red, the same shifting register of color that the Book of the Day assigns to the later hours of Ra's passage through the body of Nut, the divine vocabulary of afternoon, written in the stone of the landscape in exactly the colors that the tomb paintings use for the same stage of the journey. The rock-cut tombs open their dark mouths into the face of the cliff, their rectangular doorways cut directly into the west-facing stone, receiving the last red light of the afternoon in the minutes before the sun falls behind the ridge above them, and the cliff face goes into shadow. The west was, in the Egyptian understanding of the world's geography, the direction of transformation rather than simply the direction of ending. The dead were called those who have gone west. The necropolises were built on the west bank of the Nile, in alignment with Ra's own trajectory, a placement so consistent across so many centuries and so many sites that it was clearly not incidental, but structural. The organization of the landscape of the dead, made to mirror the organization of the divine day. To bury the dead on the west bank was to place them in the same directional relationship to the river and the sky as Ra was in at the hour of his descent, entering the realm of transformation from the same direction, crossing the same threshold, beginning the same passage that the solar god accomplished each day without interruption. Death, in this framework, was not a departure from the pattern of divine things, but a participation in it. The dead traveled in the direction Ra traveled. The west received them as the west received him. The 12th hour goddess stands at the western gate. Her image appears on the tomb walls with her name inscribed beside her in a cartouche, her arms slightly raised, her posture one of formal reception rather than urgency. She is not welcoming the bark home from a harrowing journey. She is performing her function at the appointed time, as the 11 goddesses before her performed theirs, the final gate in the sequence opening as all the others opened, the announced arrival received and confirmed, the bark passing through the last threshold of the daylight sky. Her face is turned toward the direction from which the bark arrives, her arms lifted in the gesture of acknowledgement that each hour goddess makes, and her posture holds the same quality of composed, attentive expectation that the Egyptian divine figures in these paintings nearly always hold, present, calibrated to their function, ready to perform the action that the uninterrupted functioning of the cosmos requires. The sky at the western horizon in the final minutes of the sun's descent performs its own kind of transformation. The disk, which has been white and then gold all day, turns orange as the atmosphere thickens with the longer path the light must travel to reach the ground, and then turns red, and the sky above and around it shifts through amber and violet and a deep blue that appears low on the horizon in the east, while the west is still burning. The Nile reflects all of this, first orange, then red, then holding the last pink light on its surface long after the sky around has gone deeper. The Necropolis cliffs receive the final direct light from the west for a few minutes, in which the stone seems almost to generate its own warmth, and then the ridge above catches the last sliver of disk, and the light lifts off the cliff faces in a single slow withdrawal, and the stone goes from orange to a cool pale gray in the space of less than a minute, and the apertures of the rock-cut tombs, which had been receiving the last red light directly into their west-facing doorways, now stand in shadow, the interior of each tomb a uniform dark behind the rectangular frame of its cut entrance. The association of death and west in Egyptian cosmology was not, the tradition makes clear, an association of death with loss. The west was where Ra went. The west was where Ra was most himself, in the fullest sense of his divine complexity, not the triumphant noon god, but the completed day god. All 12 hours of his passage accomplished, every gate opened and passed, every hour goddess having spoken her part, the arc from a cut in the east to the western threshold, entire and complete. A religion organized around the solar disk crossing the sky from east to west each day was necessarily a religion organized around completion, around the satisfaction of a thing done in its entirety. The full arc of it traveled from one end to the other, the final gate received, and the passage acknowledged. The west was where that completion arrived. The necropolises faced it. The dead were laid in alignment with it. The tradition held that this was the correct direction, the right relationship to maintain between the living, the dead, and the divine movement that organized the sky above them all. The tomb entrances on the West Bank cliffs face the setting sun in winter, with a directness that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The angle of the doorways, the orientation of the funerary temples built at the foot of the cliffs, the long processional ways that carried the dead from the river bank across the cultivated land to the rock-cut chambers in the escarpment, all of them aligned with the same diagonal that the winter sun traces in its descent. In the last weeks of December, standing at the river's edge on the east bank and looking across toward the Theban mountains, the sun sets in what appears to be direct alignment with certain of the great mortuary temples on the opposite bank, as though the architects knew the sun's path on those specific days and arranged the buildings to receive it. They did know. The precision of the Egyptian knowledge of the sun's annual cycle, its daily arc, its seasonal variation in rising and setting points along the horizon, was detailed and carefully maintained across centuries of observation. The hour goddesses were not decorative figures attached to a vague sense that time passes. They were the organized expression of a very specific and very thoroughly considered understanding of how the sky was structured, how time moved through it. And what divine activities were responsible for the order that made each day recognizably the same kind of event as every other day, the same arc, the same sequence, the same 12 gates, the same goddesses speaking in turn, the hieroglyphic symbol for Akut, which stood at the eastern threshold and named the horizon where Ra was born each morning, applies with equal accuracy to the western horizon where Ra descended each evening, because Akut was the horizon in general, the threshold where the sky met the earth, the point of crossing between one state of being and another. The morning Akut and the evening Akut were the same word, the same image, the disk between the mountains, the moment of transition named by the same sign at both ends of the day's arc. This symmetry was not incidental to the Egyptian understanding of the solar voyage. It was the argument. The day was a complete thing, beginning and ending at the same kind of threshold, the same disk passing through the same symbol in two different directions. What was born in the morning arrived at the evening. What arrived at the evening would be born again in the morning. The shape of this, the closed loop of it, the daily completion of it, the theological insistence that the end and the beginning were in some fundamental sense the same kind of event, was the foundation on which the entire mythology of the solar voyage rested. The last red light of an afternoon in December across the Theban necropolis lies on those pale limestone cliffs with the particular warmth of late-year sun, a warmth that has traveled a long diagonal through the atmosphere to reach the stone, that has already colored the river orange, and is turning the white ibis standing in the shallows, a warm pink that still has enough force to make the cliff faces almost luminous against the darker sky above. The rock-cut tombs stand with their doorways open to this light. Their interiors have been painted with the hours of the day, the bark on its arc, the hour goddesses at their gates, the noon figure of Ra-Hoork at the summit, the 12th goddess at the western threshold. The light enters the outer chambers for a few minutes each afternoon, falling across the painted surfaces, across the hieroglyphs that annotate each figure and each scene, across the cartouches that give the names of the gods and the hours in the neat, legible signs the Egyptian scribes refined across more than 3,000 years. And then the ridge catches the descending disk, and the light withdraws from the stone, and the tomb entrances stand open and dark in the gray late afternoon air, facing the direction that Ra has traveled on this day and every day before it, and will travel again when the eastern sky begins to pale before the next dawn, and the notch between the two mountains holds, for a moment that is repeated and has always been repeated, the first sliver of a disk coming into being above the flat delta landscape while the world below is still in shadow. Sia stands at the prow of the Manjet with his gaze directed downward toward the earth below, not scanning, not searching, simply looking with the particular steadiness of a figure whose function is to perceive continuously and without interruption, to observe the passing land the way a river observes its own banks, not commenting, not alarmed, simply present to what is there. The papyrus scepter in his hand rests loosely at his side, its stalk slightly bent near the top, its feathered crown catching nothing of the air through which the bark moves. He has been at this post, according to the oldest sources, since Ra first emerged from the dark water and set the sky in its place above the earth. Sia does not rest. He does not turn away. What the tradition holds about him is that he is not merely a god who performs perception as one of his duties, but that he is perception itself, given form and placed where it can do the most good, at the front of the vessel, from which the whole of creation is visible below, hour by hour, field by field, the wide earth moving slowly beneath the arc of the divine bark's crossing. The ancient Egyptians understood the gods of the Manjet's crew not as figures recruited for service from somewhere outside the sun god, but as faculties of Ra himself, made visible and discreet. Saya, in the pyramid texts, those oldest surviving Egyptian religious inscriptions, carved into the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty burial chambers, appears in close association with Ra in a way that the texts describe as almost anatomical. He had sprung in one telling from Ra's own body. He was not separate from the sun god so much as externalized from him, extracted and given his own form so that divine perception could stand apart from the god it served and attend to its work with its full attention. This is a particular way of thinking about what it means to know the world, and it is worth dwelling in for a moment. The idea is not that Ra perceives the earth and Saya helps him do so. The idea is that when Ra perceives the earth, what is happening is Saya, a faculty so essential to the divine nature that it requires its own name, its own scepter, its own place at the vessel's front, where the view is clearest and nothing stands between the observer and what is observed. Sita's gaze moves across the land below in the morning light. The fields of the delta are visible in their long green strips, bordered by irrigation channels that catch the sun. Villages are visible, and the broad brown curve of the river, and the distant line where cultivation ends and desert begins. He sees all of it with the same unhurried attention. In the tradition, his observation is not passive. Divine perception, in the Egyptian understanding, is itself an act that sustains what it sees, a relationship between the knowing God and the known world that keeps the known world properly itself, properly ordered, properly aligned with the mat by which everything is meant to function. Sia at the prow is not decorative. His gaze is part of what keeps the bark's passage true. Hugh stands a little further back along the deck on the port side, with one hand raised slightly before him at waist height, the palm open and facing upward, the gesture of someone who has just spoken a word that is already taking effect in the world around him. The texts of the coffin texts period, those religious compositions painted on the interiors of Middle Kingdom coffins, passed down from the older pyramid texts and elaborated into new forms, describe Hu as the authoritative utterance of the divine creator, the voice through which Ra's will becomes reality rather than intention. Where Sia perceives, Hu speaks, or rather Hu is the speaking itself, given its own form and stationed on the bark so that the creative force behind Ra's words can be present and active throughout the crossing. The two figures are always understood together in the sources that mention them: perception and utterance, the faculty that takes in the world and the faculty that acts upon it. Between them, in the theological understanding the Egyptians developed, lies something close to the whole of what it means for a divine being to be present in and responsive to the cosmos it inhabits. The raised hand of Hu has already completed its gesture. Whatever word he last spoke, and the texts do not specify the particular content, only the continual fact of the function, its effects are already spreading outward through the air around the bark. The sky remains itself because it has been told to remain so. The sun disk continues its arc because the command that set it moving has not been withdrawn. This is the logic of divine utterance in the Egyptian tradition, not a single act of creation followed by silence, but an ongoing utterance, sustained moment by moment, that holds the world in the shape it was made to be. Hu on the bark is the reason the bark continues forward. His open hand is the posture of someone who has spoken and does not need to speak again yet, because what he said is still working. The palm of his raised hand catches the afternoon light. The sun has moved past its highest point. The deck of the Manjet, painted deep blue and gold in the New Kingdom tomb illustrations, holds its course along the celestial arc. And somewhere between Sia's downward gaze and Hu's extended hand, the bark moves through its sixth and seventh hours with the particular steadiness of something that has been doing this since before any living thing existed, to watch it happen. Heka is present on the bark as well, and Heka beseint putsbiot Burning, though in a different register from Sia and Hu, not a faculty extracted from Ra's divine substance, but something more like a guardian, a force that accompanies the sun god in his crossing and stands ready to repel whatever opposes the bark's progress through the sky. The texts describe Heka, the lowercase word meaning ritual power or magical force, as the operative substance behind all priestly action at dawn. When a priest at Heliopolis raised both arms toward the eastern horizon in the moment before the sun's rim appeared above the flat delta landscape, what he was doing was deploying Heka. When he recited the words of the morning offering formula and the smoke of incense rose through the open-air court into the still early air, Heka was the force that made the ritual work, that connected the human act to the divine one, that allowed something performed in a stone temple on the west bank of the Nile to assist a god crossing the celestial ocean above. Heka the god, depicted in his characteristic form as a standing male figure with crossed scepters held at chest height, was understood to be present on the bark for a related reason. The voyage required protection, and protection, in the Egyptian understanding, was accomplished through the application of exactly this kind of ritual, operational, precisely deployed power. In the warm honey yellow used for divine flesh in New Kingdom tomb paintings, Heka stands among the crew with his scepters symmetrical, their tips angled slightly apart at their upper ends and converging below at the point where his hands hold them. He is not moving. He does not need to move. His presence on the bark is itself a form of action in this theological framework, a living guarantee that the power behind the priestly rituals performed at dawn in temples across Egypt is here, on the vessel. Those rituals are meant to assist, present in its proper and effective form. There is something very precise in this understanding. The priests on the ground performing their dawn recitations, and the god of that same power standing on the bark above them, are not two separate things happening at the same time. They are one act, distributed across two registers of reality, the divine and the human, and Heka is what holds the connection between them open. His crossed scepters catch the late morning light as the bark passes through the third and fourth hours of the day, the earth below still green and cool in the long shadows of early morning that are only now beginning to shorten. The river curves below to the east. The necropolis cliffs to the west are still in shadow, and Heka stands in his place on the deck with the stillness of a figure who is not waiting for something to happen, but is himself something that is continuously happening, continuously active, continuously deployed against the invisible pressures that bear on the bark from all directions throughout the crossing. Montu occupies a different register again. The falcon-headed god of the Theban nome, that division of Upper Egypt, whose capital city Thebes grew into one of the great centers of Egyptian civilization, was associated primarily with the scorching, destructive aspect of the midday sun. He had his own ancient cult and temple complexes dedicated specifically to him at Medamod, Tod, and Arment, north and south of Thebes, along the Nile's course. But in the context of the solar bark, Montu stands among the crew as the figure who embodies what the sun does at its most intense, the burning, relentless, dominating heat of the zenith, the quality of the solar disk at the 10th and 11th and 12th minutes of its highest hour that presses down on the earth without mercy or moderation. The Egyptian texts that describe pharaohs as mighty as Montu in their battle inscriptions are doing something specific. They are borrowing the metaphor of solar intensity and applying it to the controlled violence of royal military power, drawing a line between the god who represents the sun's most forceful aspect and the king who represents the earth's most forceful human agency. In his form as painted on New Kingdom surfaces, Montu is falcon-headed like Ra-Hodak, but the register is different. Where Ra-Hodak-Tai at the noon position carries the quiet authority of a god at the peak of his natural arc, Montu carries something more directed, more martial in its bearing. The solar disk above his head sits on a platform of double plumes, the composite headdress of a god whose associations include both solar radiance and military vigor. His posture is upright and forward. Even in the formal convention of Egyptian divine art, where posture and gesture are strictly controlled and figures do not move outside their assigned roles, Montu conveys a quality of readiness, the impression of force that could be deployed, if the bark required it, in an instant. On the deck of the Manjet, he is the midday sun in its most elemental form, the burning thing that overcomes by its own nature, that defeats disorder not through strategy, but through the sheer accumulated intensity of what it is. The shadows on the deck below Montu are the shortest they will be all day. The sun disk above the bark is at its highest point. Below, on the earth, the fields have lost their morning shadows and lie flat in the direct light. The irrigation channels turned silver, the villages white against the green of the delta, the river a sheet of reflected sky. From the Manjet at its noon position, the whole of Egypt is visible in its proper orientation, the long narrow strip of cultivation on both sides of the Nile, surrounded on every side by desert, the world arranged exactly as the tradition said it had been arranged since Atum-Ra first emerged from the primordial water and set Shu in place to hold the sky above and Geb to receive the earth below. Montu stands in the full light of what he embodies at the hour when it is most itself. The Ennead, the company of 9 gods who form the original divine lineage in the Heliopolitan tradition, does not travel continuously on the bark in the way that Sia and Hu and Heka do. Their role in the solar voyage is different, and the liturgical texts are consistent on this point. What the hymns and the ritual compositions describe is the Ennead gathering at the eastern horizon at dawn, assembled to greet Ra's emergence with the formal ceremony that his daily rebirth requires. They arrive before the sun disk clears the mountains of the horizon. They are already in position, 9 distinct figures with their identifying crowns and headdresses, each facing the same direction, the direction from which the bark approaches. When the first rim of the disk appears in the notch between the 2 horizon mountains, that the hieroglyph for Ak renders in its clean symbolic form, the greeting is not informal. Nothing about this gathering is casual. The Egyptian tradition understood the dawn as a moment of ritual necessity, a threshold that required specific acts to be performed if the crossing was to proceed safely and in the proper order. The Ennead's assembly at the horizon was one of those acts. Their presence was a form of confirmation that the company of the original divine lineage recognized the returning sun god, that the order of things remained intact, that the new day was properly received and not simply assumed. There is a formality in this that the tomb paintings capture with some precision. In the papyrus illustrations that show the Ennead assembled at the horizon, the 9 figures stand in a horizontal row, each distinct in their headdress and their identifying attributes, all oriented in the same direction, all in the posture of formal reception, arms slightly raised or held in the gesture of praise, faces forward, the whole arrangement reading like a sentence about what order looks like when it assembles itself in visible form. In the liturgical texts, the hymns to Ra sung at dawn in the great temple complexes at Heliopolis and Thebes and Memphis. The language given to the Ennead's greeting is expansive and specific. They praise the emergence. They call Ra by his many names in sequence. They address the solar disk in its aspect of Khepri, the scarab, the self-created, the one who comes into being from himself, and then address it again in its aspect of Ra, at the height of his power, and again as the aging figure who will descend toward the west as the hours advance. The greeting covers the whole day in advance, as if the Ennead's words at dawn are themselves a kind of guarantee. We have named you in all your forms, and all your forms are accounted for, and the day is therefore secured. In the tradition, this is not mere ceremony, it is operative. The naming is part of what makes the thing it names persist. Among the gathered assembly at the dawn horizon, the texts include figures that extend well beyond the Ennead's 9 members. Divine baboons appear in multiple sources, their front paws raised in the posture of greeting, their mouths open in the cry that baboons characteristically produce at actual dawn in the desert, a sound that the ancient Egyptians heard and understood as a natural, unrehearsed participation in the same moment the rituals were celebrating. The baboons at the eastern horizon in the mythological tradition are performing what real baboons were observed doing at real dawns, turning toward the rising sun and calling. The tradition takes this observation and places it inside the theological structure of the voyage, making the baboon's dawn cry a formal element of the greeting that Ra receives as he crosses the horizon. Their stone equivalents, carved along the bases of obelisks and at the entrance courts of temples, their paws raised and their mouths open in the same fixed posture, are present in the sacred architecture precisely to perpetuate this moment, to ensure that the greeting is always being given, always already in progress, the stone figures doing continuously what the mythological ones do at each dawn. At Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, the bases of certain obelisks carried carved baboons in exactly this posture. The stone is worn smooth, where centuries of morning light have fallen across it, the same light falling across the same carved gesture of raised paws and open mouths morning after morning through the 19th dynasty and the long, slow withdrawal of the tradition from active practice and all the quiet centuries after that, until the present, when the same light still falls across the same worn stone at the same angle in the first hour of each Egyptian morning. What the carving preserves is not a representation of the myth, but a participation in it, a material act of greeting built into the architecture so that the greeting cannot be neglected, cannot be forgotten, cannot be interrupted by the ordinary failures of human consistency. The stone baboons greet the sun. They have been doing it for 3,000 years. Their mouths will be open at tomorrow's dawn without any human instruction or effort, without any priest present in the early court to begin the ritual. The stone has taken over. The gesture is permanent. The gods of the hours are present in the tradition as well. Attendant at each of the 12 daylight stations along Ra's Arc, though their individual names and forms vary across the different source compositions, and the precise number and identity of the lesser divine figures who breathe fire or hold weapons or carry instruments of measurement changes depending on which text is being consulted. What the hymns consistently describe is a company, a large, purposeful, diverse assembly of divine attention directed at every point of the crossing, from the moment the bark clears the eastern horizon to the moment it descends behind the western cliffs. The solar voyage is not a solitary act. It is in the fullest form in which the tradition imagines it, a collective one, a gathering of divine faculties and divine figures and divine forces, all oriented toward the same ongoing event, all contributing something specific to what the crossing requires at each of its successive stages. The hour goddesses stand at their gates in sequence. Each one is a warden of a threshold, and her role is to announce the bark's arrival at her particular station, and to ensure that the passage from one stage of the crossing to the next is accomplished correctly and without interruption. In the formal tomb paintings where these figures appear, they are depicted as female figures with their names written in cartouches beside them, their postures those of formal reception, their faces turned toward the direction from which the bark approaches. They are not alarmed by the bark's arrival. They are ready for it. They have been ready since before this particular sun rose, since before this particular day began, since the order of the crossing was first established, and they will be ready for the same arrival at the same gate tomorrow, and the day after that, and in the uncountable succession of days that the tradition imagines stretching forward from any given present moment through all the time remaining before the world is otherwise arranged. What this gathering makes visible, held together in the mind at once, Sia at the prow with his downward gaze, Hu with his open hand and his completed utterance, Heika with his crossed scepters and his continuous deployment of ritual power, Montu burning at the zenith, the Ennead assembled at the horizon in formal praise, the baboons with raised paws and open mouths, the hour goddesses at their gates, the lesser figures breathing fire or carrying measurement or standing armed at the edges of the bark's passage, is a picture of what the ancient Egyptians meant by order. Not order as a condition achieved once and then maintained effortlessly. Order as something that has to be continually performed, continually staffed, continually renewed at each of its many constituent points by figures who each know precisely what their part in it requires. Every position on the bark is occupied. Every gate along the crossing has its warden. Every station of the sky has its attending goddess. Nothing in the crossing is left to chance or assumption. The papyrus scepter in Sia's loosely held hand has rested in that same position since the first morning of the tradition. The earth below him passes in its slow succession of fields and river bends and desert margins and oasis greens and the scattered settlements of the delta. He observes it all with the same attention he has always given it. Not urgency, not emotion, the steady continuous observing of a faculty whose nature is to observe, doing what it was made to do throughout the long warm hours of a day that has been happening in this form for longer than any particular human civilization has existed to witness it. Hudi's open palm remains at waist height. The word he last spoke is still taking effect. The sky is still the sky. The bark is still the bark. The arc of the crossing continues exactly as it was established to continue, and the utterance that sustains it has not yet needed to be renewed, because it was made, in the beginning, with the full authority of the divine voice that made the world itself, and that authority does not diminish with the passage of hours. Heika's crossed scepters remain symmetrical. Their tips angle slightly apart. The morning light that caught them in the third hour has given way to the deeper, more direct light of the midday crossing, and then to the longer, amber-edged light of the afternoon, and the scepters move through it all, unchanged, the ritual power they represent neither depleted nor required yet to act, held in readiness, the way a river holds its potential in its current before a particular configuration of the landscape asks it to fall. Montu, at the zenith, has passed his most intense hour. The shadows on the deck are beginning to lengthen again, slowly, from their noon minimum outward toward the afternoon's gradual extension. The midday burning is behind the bark now, the sun disk beginning the long, gentle decline toward the western horizon that will occupy the remaining hours of the crossing. Montu remains where he stands. His headdress of double plumes above the solar disk catches the changing light of the afternoon without changing what it is. He does not follow the declining arc with any visible adjustment to his posture. He simply remains, the way the memory of intense heat remains in warm stone after the direct sun has passed. The afternoon moves across the deck of the Manjet in the particular quality of Egyptian afternoon light, a light that is not harsh, but is very clear, that shows the surfaces it falls on without concealment, that extends the long horizontal shadows of objects across the deck's painted surface in a way that makes the deck seem wider than it is. The bark has been crossing since before anyone in the cities below was awake. The crew has been at their stations through all 12 hours of the passage. None of them have rested, because rest is not a concept that applies to figures who are in the deepest sense functions rather than persons, presences rather than individuals with needs. Sia perceives, Hu utters, Heka guards with power, Montu burns, the Ennead praises, the hour goddesses receive. And all of it is continuous, all of it uninterrupted, all of it perfectly consistent with the order it was assembled to sustain. The western horizon begins to clarify in the distance. The cliffs of the Theban necropolis, visible from certain high points along the bark's arc, are catching the first traces of the amber that will deepen over the next 2 hours into the orange and red of the Egyptian sunset. The rock faces are pale limestone, and the late light brings out the warm undertone in the stone that the harsh midday sun flattened. The entrances to the rock-cut tombs are beginning to emerge from shadow, their dark rectangular openings visible against the cliff face, each one oriented toward the west, each one in alignment with the direction the bark is now approaching. The hour goddesses of the 9th and 10th and 11th hours stand at their respective gates with the same formal reception they have maintained since the first hour. Their names are written in their cartouches beside them. Their faces are turned toward the bark. Their arms are in the posture of welcome that is also a posture of transition, not stopping the bark, but receiving it at each successive threshold and passing it forward to the next warden, and the next, and the last, and finally to the western horizon itself, where the tradition places Rhea's descent and the beginning of the night, crossing that belongs to a different part of the story. The bark moves through the 11th hour in the long, warm, amber-touched light of late afternoon, the whole of the day's arc visible in retrospect. From this position, the dawn emergence from the eastern horizon, the rising through the morning hours, the noon peak with Montu burning at the zenith, the long, slow descent of the afternoon through the company of hour goddesses and the steady presences of Sia and Hope and Heka. The 12 hours of the daylight crossing are, in this moment, almost complete. The 12th hour goddess waits at her gate. The western cliffs grow closer, clearer, warmer in the descending light. Sia's gaze remains directed downward. The earth below the bark in this last hour of the crossing is the earth of the western margin, the cultivated strip growing narrower, the desert expanding toward the horizon, the necropolis visible in the cliff face, the last fields of the agricultural zone catching the horizontal light in a way that makes every row of crops cast its own long shadow eastward across the ground. He observes all of it with the same unhurried attention he brought to the delta fields of the early morning and the midday brightness over the river and the long afternoon over the cultivated valley. His perception does not know the difference between the first hour and the 12th. It only knows to continue, to attend, to remain present to what is there. The stone baboons at the base of an obelisk in the open court of the temple at Karnak stand in the morning light that has long since shifted into afternoon. Their paws are raised, their mouths are open. The light has moved across them from east to west through the whole of the day's arc, beginning with the sharp, low-angle early light that caught the eastern faces of the carved stone and left the western faces in deep shadow, moving through the even overhead brightness of midday when the shadows retreated beneath the carved bodies of the baboons, and the court was fully illuminated, and now arriving at the amber-edged afternoon light that catches the western faces of the stone figures and leaves the eastern faces cool and dim. The carved gesture has not changed. The paws are raised in the same posture they have held since the stone was shaped. The open mouths are open to the same sky that has been above them for 3,000 years of mornings, the same sky that receives the bark's passage each day and holds it in the arc between the two horizons. They are greeting something that has already passed overhead and is now descending toward the west, or they are greeting something that has not yet risen and will rise tomorrow, or both at once, which is perhaps the point, a gesture of welcome that does not belong only to the particular instant of dawn, but extends through the whole of what dawn means, which includes everything that came before it and everything that will follow from it. The stone captures one moment of the gesture. The stone makes that moment permanent. And so the baboons are always at the threshold of greeting, always poised in the instant before the sun clears the horizon, always in the act of recognizing what the tradition says is worth recognizing with one's full body, one's raised paws, one's open mouth lifted toward the sky. The morning light will fall across them again tomorrow, moving left to right across the carved stone from the eastern angle of early dawn. The same light, the same stone, the same gesture, held in the same worn and ancient form, offered to the same sky, for the same reason, without interruption, without variation, without the need for any individual to remember to perform it, or any institution to continue supporting its performance. The stone has taken the gesture out of time and placed it permanently at the edge of every morning, where it will continue for as long as the stone stands and the sun rises, and the tradition that understood why this greeting mattered continues, in whatever form traditions continue, to hold this particular, quiet, deeply considered act of recognition among the things worth preserving in the world. In the lamplight of an inner temple chamber, before the first gray suggestion of dawn has appeared at the edge of the sky, a priest holds a small object in the palm of his hand. It is made of wax. It is no longer than a finger, slightly tapered, slightly rough at the edges, where the wax was pressed and shaped by hand. Along its body, in hieratic script, a name has been inscribed, pressed into the warm surface with the tip of a reed, each small mark deliberate, each mark necessary. The object has been warm from being held. The room around it smells of incense and lamp oil, and the particular cold mineral smell of dressed stone that has not yet caught the heat of the day. The lamp flame moves once, and then is still. This is how the morning began, in temple after temple along the length of the Nile, for centuries beyond easy counting, not with hymns first, and not with the opening of shrine doors, but with this, a priest in a dark room, holding something small, doing something that needed to be done before Ra could safely rise. The object in his hand was an effigy of Apophis, known in the Egyptian language as Apep or Api, the great serpent whose existence the Egyptian religious tradition understood as a standing threat to the solar bark and everything that bark carried with it. The name inscribed along the wax body was not decoration. In Egyptian ritual logic, to write the name of a thing upon its image was to bind the thing itself, to make the wax figure in the vast mythological serpent answerable to the same action. The inscription was the mechanism. What happened to the effigy was understood to happen through that inscription to the serpent behind the name. Apophis was not a late addition to Egyptian religious thought, not a figure who crept in at the margins and was eventually tolerated. The tradition held him as something older than order itself, a serpent of primordial darkness whose nature was simply the negation of the structured, light-bearing, life-sustaining world that Ra's daily passage maintained. The two things could not coexist entirely. Every morning that Ra rose was in this understanding a morning on which Apophis had been turned back. Every morning without exception, including this one, including all the mornings that had come before any temple stood to hold the ritual. The scale of what the priests were managing with their wax figures and their lamp oil is worth holding in mind for a moment before the ritual itself is described. When an eclipse occurred, when the sun disk dimmed or vanished from the sky in the middle of the day, the Egyptian understanding was precise and unambiguous. Apophis had succeeded, at least momentarily, in swallowing Ra. The darkness was not astronomical. It was the serpent's body closing around the disk. This meant that every eclipse, from the smallest dimming to the full occultation of the sun, was treated as an emergency requiring immediate, intensified ritual response from every available priest. The normal daily practice was scaled upward. More effigies, more fire, more incense, more of everything that the tradition prescribed for the management of the serpent, deployed with urgency rather than the measured calm of the ordinary dawn. And when the sun returned, as it always did, as it always had, that return was not taken as evidence that the eclipse had been merely astronomical. It was taken as evidence that the ritual had worked. This is, in its way, an elegant system. It can never be disproven from inside itself. Every morning that the sun rises is a morning that confirms the practice. Every eclipse that ends is an eclipse the ritual resolved. The priests who performed these rites were not performing them with doubts about their efficacy that they were quietly suppressing. The tradition does not suggest ambivalence. It suggests a living, institutionally supported, architecturally funded conviction that the daily passage of Ra required active human assistance, and that without that assistance, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The most complete surviving text for the management of Apophis is the document scholars call the Book of Overthrowing Apophis, and the most complete surviving version of that book is preserved in a papyrus, now held in the British Museum, the Bremner Rind Papyrus, dating to the 4th century BCE. If that document is open to the relevant sections and read, even in translation, even at this remove, what becomes apparent is not vagueness or allegory, but specificity. The instructions are procedural. They describe in order exactly what is to be done. The effigy is to be bound with black thread. It is to be spat upon. It is to be stabbed with knives. Its vertebrae are to be crushed, one by one, each crushing accompanied by the appropriate spoken spell, and then it is to be burned. The text names each action. The text provides the words to be spoken during each action. The text is not a philosophical meditation on the nature of chaos. It is a manual. The care embedded in its specificity, the fact that someone took the time in the 4th century BCE to write these instructions down in full, to preserve the exact sequence, to make sure that the crushing of the vertebrae and the burning were done in the right order with the right words, that care is a document of something real. Not real in the sense that a wax figure actually contains a cosmic serpent. Real in the sense that the people doing this work believed, with the full weight of an institutional tradition behind them, that it mattered how precisely it was done. The ink on the Bremner Rind papyrus has browned with age. The columns of hieratic script are dense and regular. The papyrus is slightly crinkled at the edges where it was once rolled, the surface a little uneven, the way very old paper carries the memory of how it was stored. The words of the spell for burning Apophis are still legible to trained eyes. The instructions are still there. They outlasted the temples that used them, the priests who performed them, the institutional structure that trained those priests, and maintained the ritual calendar, and stocked the temple storerooms with the wax and thread and the particular grade of incense each procedure required. The papyrus was written late in the tradition. It was collecting something that had already been practiced for a very long time. Apophis was depicted in Egyptian art as enormous. The scale of the serpent in tomb paintings and papyrus illustrations is always excessive, a body that dwarfs the bark it threatens, coils that could contain entire sections of the sky. The tradition was not interested in making the threat seem manageable. The point was precisely that the threat was not manageable by any individual, by any single act of will, by anything less than the full mobilization of divine and priestly force working in coordination. This is part of what makes the ritual economy around the serpent so large. It required large things to address it, and yet the tradition also had, alongside this immense and procedurally demanding serpent, a figure whose role in the management of chaos was unexpected. Set. Set is not, across the full range of Egyptian mythology, an uncomplicated figure. He is the god who killed his brother Osiris. He is associated with storms and desert, and the violent, disruptive edges of the ordered world. Egyptian iconography renders him with his distinctive squared animal ears, an animal not identified with any real species, a creature that exists only in the visual vocabulary of Egyptian divine art, and he carries the energy of something that does not sit comfortably inside the structures that the other gods maintain. In most of the contexts in which Set appears, that quality is a problem to be contained or a wrong to be answered. Aboard the solar bark, it is exactly what is needed. In the context of the voyage across the sky, Set stands at the prow of the Manjet, the great solar vessel carrying Ra through the 12 hours of daylight, armed with a spear, and his role is to strike Apophis when the serpent attacks. The same quality that made Set the killer of Osiris makes him, in this specific context, the one figure aboard the bark capable of meeting a force of absolute negation with sufficient violence to turn it back. His own chaotic nature is the weapon. The tradition does not resolve the tension in this. It holds it. Set is the murderer of Osiris and the defender of Ra, and both things are true, and the tradition does not seem interested in collapsing one truth into the other for the sake of consistency. In New Kingdom tomb paintings, Set at the prow of the bark is depicted with his squared ears above the railing, his spear angled forward and downward into the water below. The composition is contained within the formal register of Egyptian divine art, balanced, proportioned, the figures stylized in the way all Egyptian divine figures are stylized. The whole image held within the wider horizontal procession of the bark, and its crew painted across the wall or ceiling of the tomb. Set is aggressive and alert. The painting is not. The painting is orderly. This is one of the characteristic qualities of Egyptian sacred art. It can depict cosmic violence within a visual register of perfect formal composure. The spear goes into the water. Apophis does not appear in many of these paintings, or appears only as a shape below the bark, a coil visible at the edge of the image, the rest implied. The threat is there. The gesture of repulsion is there. The outcome is legible from the posture. And the bark moves forward along its arc, and the crew continues their various functions, and Ra proceeds through the sky, and the day completes itself. This pattern, the threat always present, always met, never finally resolved, is structural to how the Egyptian tradition understood Apophis. He was not a figure who would eventually be defeated once and for all. The ritual instructions in the Bremner Rend papyrus are daily instructions, not instructions for a final battle. Each morning, the effigy was made and destroyed. Each day, the spear was at the prow. Each evening, the bark arrived safely at the western horizon. And the next morning, the same practice began again, because the same threat would be there again, unchanged, requiring the same response. There is something almost meditative in this. The tradition did not imagine a resolution to the opposition between Ra and Apophis. It imagined a sustained, daily, methodically maintained management of that opposition. The priests who burned the wax figures at dawn were not working toward a future in which the burning would no longer be necessary. They were maintaining something, tending to it. The way a fire is tended, not made once and left, but returned to, fed, attended, kept. The architectural investment in this maintenance was substantial. The sun temples of the Old Kingdom, built by the pharaohs of the 5th dynasty in the 25th and 24th centuries BCE, were dedicated structures, not tomb temples or mortuary complexes, but temples built for the daily solar worship that the voyage required. The Temple of Nu-Zir at Abu Ghorab, constructed around 2416 BCE, included a large open-air altar platform where offerings were made under direct sunlight, the sky overhead, and the day's light present as a participant in the ritual rather than merely its backdrop. At the center of the altar court stood an alabaster altar shaped into the form of the hieroglyph for Hotep, a word that carries the meanings of offering, of satisfaction, of peace that comes from the proper completion of what was owed. The hieroglyph for Hotep shows a flat offering table with a loaf of bread on it and a mat beneath. An alabaster at the scale of an altar, it becomes a surface for real offerings placed on a shape that means offering. The object and the word for the object are the same form. This kind of layering, where the physical thing and its symbolic meaning are pressed together so that one cannot be fully separated from the other, runs through the entire material culture of Egyptian solar worship. The effigy of Apophis is both a small wax figure and the serpent itself, by virtue of the inscription. The altar is both an offering surface and the hieroglyphic sign for what an offering does. Standing at the Abu Ghorab altar in morning light, an Egyptian priest would have been standing inside a word, as well as inside a temple. The shadows of the offerings placed on the carved stone surface fell across the hieroglyphic form of satisfaction. The sky above was the sky Ra was crossing. The ritual and its meaning were not separate levels of the experience. They were simultaneous. The daily solar offerings at these sun temples were part of what scholars have called a ritual economy, a system of labor, agricultural production, priestly training, architectural maintenance, and calendar management, and be all organized around the requirement that specific things be done at specific times in specific ways to support the sun's passage. This was not a small operation. The The Fifth Dynasty Sun Temples required staff, funding, storage facilities for offerings, a calendar precise enough to govern the timing of rituals to the hour, and the accumulated knowledge of how to perform each rite correctly. That knowledge was held and transmitted by a priestly class whose training was itself a significant institutional investment. The priests who performed the morning Apophis ritual were not improvising. They had been taught. They were teaching, in turn, the specific sequence of actions in the Brahmana Rind papyrus: the binding, the spitting, the stabbing, the crushing of the vertebrae, the burning, was a transmitted sequence, passed from one trained practitioner to the next, refined and stabilized over generations until it was written down in full in the 4th century BCE, not because it was newly invented then, but because the written record was a way of preserving what had already existed for a very long time in practice. What was being preserved, underneath all the procedural specificity, was a particular conviction about the relationship between human action and cosmic order. The tradition held that Ra's crossing was not self-sustaining, that the sun did not simply rise because it rose. It rose because the bark was properly crewed, because Set was at the prow, because the hour goddesses announced each transition, because Ma'at's presence on the deck maintained the conditions under which ordered passage was possible, and because, here is the human part, the priests in the temples below were doing what needed to be done before dawn, with their wax and their fire and their carefully transmitted spells. This framing placed humanity inside the cosmological order rather than outside it. Observing, the priests were not performing symbolic gestures in honor of a process that would happen regardless of whether the gestures were made. They were participants. Their work was load-bearing, or at least the tradition held that it was, and the tradition governed the allocation of enormous resources toward ensuring that it was done correctly. The sun, in this understanding, was not indifferent. The relationship between Ra and the human world was one of mutual dependence, carefully maintained. Ra needed the ritual as surely as the world needed the light. The pharaoh, who bore the title Son of Ra, Sa-Ra in the Egyptian language, was both the earthly counterpart of the solar disk and the guarantor of the ritual structures that supported Ra's passage. When the pharaoh commissioned a sun temple, when the pharaoh funded a priestly college, when the pharaoh ordered that the morning rituals be performed without interruption, he was doing his part of a bargain, the tradition described as very old and very necessary. The bargain was not spoken of as a burden. The hymns that survive from the temple liturgies are not anxious texts, they are celebratory texts. They describe the rising of the sun in language that is warm and expansive and full of gladness, not the gladness of relief that catastrophe was narrowly averted, but the gladness of a thing completing itself exactly as it should, exactly as it always has, exactly as it will again tomorrow. One of the recurring images in these morning hymns is the assembled gods at the eastern horizon, greeting Ra's emergence with raised paws and songs. The baboons, those actual animals, Hamadrya's baboons, who do in fact vocalize loudly at dawn, whose real behavior was read by the Egyptians as a form of worship, were carved in stone along the bases of obelisks, their paws raised, their mouths open in the gesture of the greeting cry. At Karnak, those carved baboons have been worn smooth by centuries of morning light falling across the same stone gesture. The light that falls on them now is the same kind of light that fell on them when they were new. The gesture has not changed. The baboons are still greeting something at the horizon, in stone, as they have every morning since the carvers finished and moved on to other work. there is a quality to that image that carries more weight than almost anything else the tradition left behind, more in some ways than the elaborate tombs and the painted ceilings and the dense procedural texts. A row of carved stone animals, paws raised, mouths open, worn smooth not by visitors' hands but by light, by time, by the ordinary passage of the thing they were carved to greet. They do not know that the priests are gone. They do not know that the ritual calendar no longer governs the planting seasons of the Nile Delta, that the wax effigies are no longer made and burned in the inner temple chambers at dawn, that the great institutional structure that supported all of this has been still for a very long time. The stone baboons are still doing what they were made to do. Morning after morning, Ra comes over the eastern horizon, and the carved stone mouths are open, and the carved stone paws are raised, and the gesture of welcome is exactly as it always was. The tradition imagined that without this welcome, without the crew of the bark, without the rituals below, the sun might not come. And yet the sun continued to come, long after the rituals stopped. This is not a contradiction that the tradition ever had to face. It is simply the way things turned out. The rituals stopped, the sun continued, and what that means or does not mean is a question the tradition was not built to answer, because the tradition was not built in anticipation of its own ending. What it was built in anticipation of was this: one more dawn, and then another, and then the one after that. The wax effigy in the priest's hand in the dark room before dawn was for this morning specifically, not for all mornings in the abstract. For this one, the inscription on its body was freshly pressed, the spell was freshly spoken, the fire was freshly lit, and when the burning was done and the ashes were scattered in the way the instructions prescribed, the priest would have moved through the temple to the next station of the morning rite. Because there were more things to do before Ra could safely rise, and the morning was not waiting for the ritual to be ready, and the eastern horizon was already beginning, in the way it always begins, to separate itself from the darkness. The sky at the eastern horizon, in those last minutes before the rim of the sun appears, has a quality that is difficult to describe precisely. The darkness does not simply lighten, it stratifies. The deepest blue remains in the west and at the zenith, while the east begins to separate into distinct layers, a thin brightness at the very line of the horizon, a band of pale gold or gray just above it, and above that a sky still dark enough to be night. The mountains of the horizon, if there are mountains, become visible first as a darker shape against a slightly lighter sky, a silhouette before a silhouette. The distinction between rock and air, very faint, and then, minute by minute, slightly less faint. Egyptian cosmological text describe this moment as the emergence of Khepri, the scarab, the coming into being, from the body of Nut, the sky goddess, at her eastern boundary. The horizon is her fingertips. The notch between the mountains is the exact point of emergence, and the bark, which has been traveling through the night by a different route, arrives at this point precisely on time, precisely as it always has, the momentum of its passage indistinguishable from the will of the god aboard it. When the disk clears the horizon and the first light falls on the Nile, the surface of the river catches it in long horizontal columns of brightness, moving slowly with the current. The Nile at dawn, in the moment of first light, is not dramatic. The light comes evenly, all at once, diffused by the river's breadth and the flat land on either side, and the reflection on the water is long and quiet and moving slowly south as the current always moves, carrying whatever it carries. The light that falls there is not different in kind from the light that fell there 3,000 years ago. The river moves the same way. The reflection is the same shape. This is what the tradition was organized around. Ultimately, beneath all its procedural complexity and its enormous institutional structures and its vast cosmological architecture, this, the light on the water, the disk clearing the horizon, the moment, repeated without interruption across a span of time longer than any single human mind can hold comfortably, in which the world was again illuminated, again warm, again visibly the world. The Bremner Rind Papyrus is in the British Museum. The alabaster altar at Abu Ghorab is still in the desert south of Cairo, worn by wind and time, the hieroglyphic form of Hotep, still readable on its surface in the right light. The stone baboons at Karnak still raise their paws each morning, worn smooth, still oriented toward the east. And the sun disk, indifferent in the way that only very old things can be indifferent, not cold, but simply not attending to whether it is being attended to, continues to clear the eastern horizon each morning, to move across the sky in the long arc the tradition described, to carry whatever light is available on any given day across the width of the world, and to descend in the late afternoon toward the western cliffs, where the entrances to the rock-cut tombs face outward into the last of the light. The tomb doors are open to the west because the west is where Ra goes last. The dead inside are oriented toward the direction of Ra's final passage, the direction of transformation, the threshold that leads to whatever comes next. The tradition understood the West not as an ending, but as a gate, the same kind of gate as the eastern horizon, a threshold through which something passes and is not lost but changed. The sun that enters the west in the evening is the same sun that rises in the east in the morning. The tradition held this firmly. The passage through what lies between is part of the arc, not the arc's interruption. Enspurt, the disk that descended into the western horizon, and the disk that rose above the eastern horizon were a single continuous thing, making a single continuous journey in a circle so large that its circularity was only visible to those who had taken the trouble to map the whole of it. The priests who burned the wax figures at dawn were contributing to a circle they could not fully see. They were doing their portion of something vast on the basis that their portion mattered, and that the vast thing required their portion specifically. This is, stripped of its particular details, a remarkably durable way to organize a relationship between human beings and the world they live in. The specific details, the wax, the hieratic script, the reed pen pressing names into warm surfaces by lamplight, belong entirely to the Egyptian tradition, to its specific history and geography and centuries of accumulated theological refinement. But the underlying posture, we are participants in something vast and ongoing, and our participation is not optional. That posture is recognizable. The tradition went on for a very long time. The 5th dynasty sun temples were already ancient by the time the Bremner Rind Papyrus was written. The morning rituals described in that papyrus had been performed in various forms and with various refinements for something close to 2,000 years before they were committed to that particular sheet of papyrus in the 4th century BCE. 2,000 years of dawn managed in the way the tradition prescribed. 2,000 years of priests in inner temple chambers before the light came, doing what needed to be done. The last person to perform these rituals did not know they were the last. The tradition was not discontinued by an announcement. It wound down as institutions wind down, gradually and without a clear terminal moment, as the world around it changed in ways that made the ritual calendar less and less central to the structures that governed daily life. The last morning in which these specific spells were spoken over a wax figure of Apophis was a morning like any other morning in the practice. The priest who spoke them had been taught by someone who had been taught, and they may well have taught someone else in turn, and at some point in the chain, the teaching stopped, not because anyone decided it should stop, but because the conditions that sustained it were no longer present, and the sun continued to rise. This morning, too. The disk that cleared the eastern horizon this morning followed the same arc the tradition mapped. The bark, if the tradition is held in mind as one holds any very old and very particular way of understanding the world, with calm interest and without the impulse to resolve its claims against what is now known, is perhaps still making its passage. That in his noon form, falcon-headed, the solar disk at its highest point, the shadows on the deck of the Manjet at their shortest, set at the prow, his squared ears above the railing, his spear at the angle that the paintings show it. Matt at the bow, the ostrich feather, steady in no wind that moves from a physical direction. The afternoon light is long and golden, the bark is descending, the western cliffs are catching the last of the red light above the cultivated strip, and the river,